Let's talk about a company that we're adding to the portfolio. We do have a new company that we're kicking off the new year with, a new trade. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the company that we're adding now?
I thought this was a very light show, lacking in any nerdiness with a chain of thought, reasoning models, all that. So I decided let's also dive into semiconductor equipment. So we're going to be adding LAM research. It's been down about 8% in the past month. It's gained a little back today as we record this, but 36% from July 10th. I've talked about, David, the semiconductor equipment industry and historical returns and why it's relatively attractive. You look at this industry, it's about $133 billion in size. There's a general rule of thumb that however big the semiconductor industry is, this is going to be about 15 to 20%. And all the major companies have seen outstanding returns the past decade. And the reason for that is you have a lot of different kind of verticals within semiconductor equipment. And generally, you only have 2 or 3 major competitors in each vertical. So if we look at the 5 biggest companies, we've got ASML, which we've talked about before. That's the monopoly on cutting edge lithography, transferring the chip design onto a wafer. We've got Applied Materials, which has the most broad portfolio. We've got LAM Research and Tokyo Electron. They're involved in etch and deposition, which we'll talk more about momentarily. And then KLA, which dominates metrology, which is looking for defects in chips. Now, between these 5 companies, they're $93 billion in revenue, and I said it was about $133 billion in size. So you're able to get roughly 2/3 of the industry just looking at this group. I always want to start kind of giving the high level overview of how you start attacking kind of an opportunity. It's trying to understand from a high level what's going on here. So let's dig into why specifically we're going to be singling out LAM Research today. It's a company with a market cap of $90 billion. It's got $15.6 billion in revenue, $4.1 billion in earnings. So that's pretty attractive margin profile, $4.8 billion in free cash flow. So if we look at multiples based off that, 23 times trailing earnings, 19 times cash flow, 20 times forward earnings, those are all below market multiples. And the reason they're all below market multiples is because on July 10th, there's new export restrictions announced by the US targeting China. That's been an anchor across the entire semiconductor industry, but it's hurt these companies, because most of these companies are 40 to 50% sales to China. LAM Research is 42%. These restrictions are potentially painful. We've probably seen kind of a pull forward of demand, which could complicate things in the year ahead. But again, David, we're being compensated with a stock that's 36% cheaper that, across the past decade was a company that grown 600% and maintains a very dominant position. So we're going to take some of that pain today for, the potential for upside as they work through these restrictions. So let's talk about what LAM Research does. I talked about deposition, etch. It's their 2, biggest specialties, 2 massive markets. ASML gets a lot of attention. Lithography is about 22% of spend for semiconductor equipment. Deposition is 28, etch is 28, and there's subverticals there, but these are big areas. What etch does is lithography transfers the chip design. You still need to engrave the design into a wafer. That's where etching comes in. The other thing is chips are going 3D in multiple directions. Memory, that's specific to AI, we'll talk about this, it's stacking 3D, but transistors are also going 3D as well. They're getting more and more complicated to build. And that's where deposition and adding all these layers comes in. So LAM Research has 4 different opportunities that they see becoming billion-dollar opportunities around growth areas. So the first area is technology around making transistors more intricate. It's called gate-all-around. And that's going to benefit them tremendously. The second is they've developed a dry film that actually reduces the demand for ASML's machines. So part of the reason ASML has struggled a little bit is what you call the intensity, the need for their machines has decreased, in part because innovations from LAM research. The third is a technology called backside power. I'm not going to get into that, but it is something should benefit from AI. And the last is advanced packaging. I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about this because earlier I talked about this need for more memory from these AI models. And, why do you need more memory? Because you're having to store the parameters, you're having to store all the work that you're doing in inferencing. It's just incredibly memory intensive. And there's a special kind of memory we've talked about on this show before. It's called high bandwidth memory. And what you do is you essentially stack the memory on the logic die. So you're stacking the memory on top of the chip from NVIDIA or Broadcom or AMD. And then you're basically drilling through it to directly connect. Well, it happens that LAM Research is a leader in this space. And their advanced packaging for this new type of memory, it grew from about 300 million to 1 billion this year. And the forecast for this HBM market is going from something like 15 billion to 100 billion by 2030. So right now, this is only 6% of LAM sales, but it could be an incredible tailwind at their back. And it's just one of the 4 opportunities I talked about earlier. So David, a key theme that we've talked about is being responsive to changes. As we're seeing something like new reasoning models spin up, what does that change? Well, if it's changing memory and people are saying that there's a good chance that memory is going to actually outgrow kind of chip sales for AI, well, we want to be responsive to that. So we're making kind of investment targeting this opportunity. We're going to put $10,000 in LAM research. And I'm going to continue looking at some opportunities in the space. There's some pure play companies entirely focused on advanced packaging. And there's other companies in the semiconductor equipment space. But I want to make a first buy that was topical to what we talked about on today's show. And I want to make sure if people's brains weren't full from talking about reasoning models that we got even nerdier at the end, David. So that's why we're adding LAM research. And I don't think this is the last stock we're going to add. If this semiconductor equipment attracts it's 15 or 20% of semiconductors, you want to have some exposure to that in the portfolio. So we will continue looking for opportunities.
I mean, you mentioned the market kind of adjusting for the changes with sales to China. And the outgoing administration has had some combative relations with China. The incoming administration may also, unclear whether it's going to be play hardball with China or maybe it'll be relaxed. Is that, are you viewing that as that's not going to be resolved? Or is that any part of your thesis on that part of the business changing? Or do you feel like it's, we have enough exposure to these other areas. If we hit an inflection point in one of them, it doesn't really matter if their sales to China are kind of permanently damaged?
Yeah, LAM, there were some new export control measures that were announced, and they came out and said, we are not updating our financial guidance. So I think partially pessimism is probably a little overpriced in the stock right now. The second thing is, how'd you read into how Trump's going to react to China? Man, that's a good question. I do think one thing is, his administration is much more likely to want to make a deal and potentially have some concessions to be able to get a grander trade deal in other areas. So I think it's hard to play any specific theme around geopolitics, but I do see some scenarios where their environment is actually better in the next 4 years than it will have been trending in the last 4. But we'll have to monitor that, and frankly, we have to monitor it for a number of stocks in the portfolio. And we talked last week about how Broadcom, they have a deal with ByteDance, which is a Chinese company that owns TikTok, to design custom chips, and that could be very meaningful. The number 2 buyer of NVIDIA chips last year, even though NVIDIA has to sell different chips to China that are not as powerful, the number 2 buyer of NVIDIA chips last year was ByteDance. So we're kind of having to watch the situation across the entire portfolio. And while LAM Research has taken the brunt and other semiconductor companies, this is weighing on kind of every company across the portfolio right now.
All right. Well, that's LAM research. Next episode, I'll make the promise that we'll do kind of a quick review of the portfolio. If we have any new listeners and you're kind of wondering what is this AI portfolio they're talking about, a few months ago, Eric took $500,000 of his own money and kind of agreed to manage it in full view of the listeners of this podcast. So next episode, we'll do a quick review of the portfolio, kind of where it stands. It's been a good couple months. We've had some winners like Credo. Really a lot of winners actually in over the dozen companies in the portfolio. So we'll be sure to give a full review of that